Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NTI PodTalk. My name is Dianne Kaler, and I'm the Director of Nutrition Therapy Institute. This PodTalk is our opportunity to have fun conversations with interesting people who have interesting things to say about nutrition, food, and health. I talk to NTI instructors, students and grads, to health industry professionals, to farmers, and anyone else who has an interest in nutritional wellness. While many of our listeners come from within the NTI community as students and grads, we also have prospective students who tune in. And to those listeners in particular, I hope you find that the people we talk to inspire you to finally make the jump to pursue your passion and come to school here at NTI. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Hello, everyone. This is Dianne Kaler, Director of Nutrition Therapy Institute, back for another edition of the NTI PodTalk. Today, I am so happy to have Alexia Kulwiec on, who is from the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. And I'm going to have her talk about what her position is there and what they do. But I think this is a really important conversation for us, for our community, because this is an organization that is in support of us being able to access high quality foods, which we all know that's a focus of ours here at NTI. Knowing about high quality foods and being able to access them are of critical importance. So thank you, Alexia, so much for being here. I really do appreciate your time today.
No, thank you so much for having us. And we're thrilled to see what NTI does and what your educational programs are like. So we're thrilled to be here with you.
Great, great. All right, so let's start off. Tell me what's your position there, and then we'll get into what actually is the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So again, I'm Alexia Kulwiec, and I am the Executive Director of Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. And we are a 501c4 nonprofit organization.
Okay. And so, the name Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund implies that you are providing legal defense. And right. Can you talk about what that is and what is the farm to consumer aspect of this legal defense?
Sure. No, thank you. First, I'll just say generally, so folks learn more about the organization, that our mission is to protect, defend, and broaden the rights and viability of independent farms, artisanal food producers, and the consumers, right? And I know that at NTI, you're really about finding access to wholesome foods, and then using that in your nutrition and your cooking and in your food preparation. And what I would say, as you see in our name, we're very focused on direct to consumer sales, is we're very interested in protecting the rights of food producers generally. A lot of our members are farmers, their ability to raise food and sell it directly to consumers. And that might sound like, well, why is that so difficult? But really policy at both the federal level, the state level, and we can get more into this in individual township and county levels, also really do play a role in discouraging independent farms and independent farm sales directly to consumers. And so we work primarily on sort of two levels. One is providing direct legal representation. So when farmers are getting into trouble with regulatory agencies, we will help them through that process. We might have litigation that helps them through a legal process. We may be helping them find ways around what otherwise would be a limiting regulation that stops them from producing. And by that, I mean things like cow shares, herd share agreements that we do for our members, helping them sell live animals so they can bring it to custom slaughter where meat processing is otherwise an issue. So sort of helping them through finding ways to be able to actually provide these good, wholesome, farm fresh goods directly to the consumer. But then we also do some policy work trying to change these legal obstacles that make it so difficult for farms and food producers to be able to prepare food and sell it to consumers.
Mhm. So a couple of things that I want to say so that I don't forget them. Number one, I think we should talk about kind of, you mentioned cow share, farm or herd share. And it's my understanding that the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund originally started in support of raw milk dairies. So I think that's a good thing to talk about. But then just to, again, create some, overview for this entire conversation. And there are things that I don't understand about this. There are things that I do understand about it, but why are policies antagonistic to, federal policies, state policies, local municipal policies? Why are they antagonistic to farmers and other food producers to be able to provide food, sell foods directly to consumers?
Right. Well, I would suggest the answer to that is not necessarily crystal clear or a simple one. But one thing that I would say, the cynical, although I think is a big part of it, is a lot of these policies are aimed at larger producers. And some of them began with some support to agricultural producers to ensure that to assist in our food supply. But as time went on, it really assisted these larger producers. And when you're in large production, you need a series of food safety regulations to ensure the safety of the food supply. And so one of the things that happens is we have policies to make sure, for example, meat processing is safe, but those requirements can't be satisfied on a small scale, first and foremost in terms of expense, but also your smaller independent farms don't wish to use some of those methods because it really takes away from the health and nutrition of the foods, right? So I think that the real answer to why are these policies against the farmers in a lot of ways is because they've been driven by larger industrial players who are able to take on certain expenses and who are able to produce at large volumes, but only with a different level of regulations in place to regulate them. I will also say that we are seeing some antagonistic regulations as there's a tension between how maybe more urban people live versus more rural people, or how farmers live. And as more and more people, I think, are understanding the benefits to real food, whole food, we see producers in the urban centers or maybe in more ex-urban centers than we used to. There used to be a real divide, I think, between our farming communities and urban centers. And we're starting to see that change, but then we see a tension between the citizens that want to be in a more urban environment and not deal with noise or odors or the things that come along with farming, a tension between them and then folks that are doing the production. Those are two things that I think come into play. And we're seeing the latter is pretty common today as we see more people moving away from urban centers into areas where agriculture has been done for years, but they don't want to, experience some of the farming, characteristics that would be in that community. So it's a tension amongst folks, which I think is a frustrating tension because it's food production and we need to produce food, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very frustrating one. Yeah.
Yeah. And certainly all of us participate in the food system in some way, shape, or form, right? Every day, multiple times per day, we all participate in the food system. And I think it's so important for consumers to really understand the production side of the food system. And I think maybe sometimes it's just a matter of educating consumers about the food production side, because there are things that are, that consumers may not be used to, some, as you say, smells, sounds, those kinds of things. But it's part of us being able to have access to real food.
Right.
Because, there's lots of companies out there that are just itching to produce lots of fake foods, artificial foods, in quotes,
Yes.
for us. And if we want to push back on that, we have to actually support the producers of real food, which is something that I am very passionate about, and something that I think, you obviously are very passionate about, the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund organization. So, all right. So, as I want to know, like, when was the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund started? I feel like it's been a while so that I've known about it. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it started with originally raw milk, production, raw milk dairies. And if you can kind of talk about that very beginning history.
Sure. Yes. So we started July 4th, 2007. The date is significant because the organization was started with the idea that we should have more rights in terms of producing and choosing our own food source, right? As American citizens. You are absolutely correct that in the beginning, it really stemmed from efforts to provide access to raw milk, right? And so raw milk, as I'm sure you know, cannot be sold interstate, so across state lines. It is prohibited under federal law to sell raw milk. And this is an example where I talk about it, the rules being for large industrial operators, right? If you've got 10,000 dairy cows who never go to pasture and whose milk is getting combined with one another, you're going to need some safety things in place. But if you're an independent farm who are pasturing your animals and doing things correctly, not only is raw milk safe, but it's, as you know better than I, has better nutritional value, right? Mm-hmm. So the organization started to try to find a way to allow for consumers to access and producers to produce raw milk. You can't do it across state lines, but some states allow for the sales of raw milk. Some states prohibit it, although that is becoming fewer and far between. Many have a strong regulatory system in place to allow for the sales. But one thing that, as an organization, in addition to starting to work on policy to make it easier to sell raw milk, the organization was involved in helping people set up these herd share arrangements as a way to make raw milk accessible to consumers. And so what that means is, in a lot of states, there is a personal exemption to any prohibition on the providing of raw milk. And so if you have ownership in the dairy herd, there's no sale taking place. It's your product from your share of your herd of dairy animals, and you're entitled to that product. And so we work with our members, raw dairy farmers who have a dairy herd, and they can sell shares in that herd to consumers who now have a share in that herd and have a right to some proportion of what's produced by that dairy herd. And it's a way that they can have access to really good, healthy, nutritional raw milk that provides just, a lot of health benefits. And so the organization was very much started around the idea of providing that access and helping folks through the legal problems associated with providing raw milk. Mm-hmm. We have since broadened out, right, to a lot of other really farms growing all kinds of food and even producing food. It may be somebody preparing meals and wanting to provide meals without having to have a home kitchen license or something like that. It might be cottage food. So we've certainly spanned beyond the raw milk, but you're 100% right that was the origins of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue into my asking you, can you talk about any stories, like particular stories that really helps our listeners understand the challenges and some of the obstacles that farmers are up against, and then how your involvement, the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund organization involvement helped, help that farmer to be able to overcome those challenges and continue to do what they want to do?
Yeah, sure. I can think of several. Two that come in mind. One several years ago in Michigan, in an agricultural community, one of our members decided to start selling more directly from the farm. So instead of bringing it to farmers markets or to find other outlets, allowing people to come directly to the farm and just purchase from the farm. That sounds ideal to me. It sounds ideal, I think, to a lot of your constituents. And even though it was an agricultural community, the township did not like there being, traffic or people driving down these roads or having to park along the road to go purchase their food, and suggested that the farm needed some kind of a business license and was unlawfully selling food directly to the consumers from the farm. And then as this case progressed, the township also suggested that the members' livestock facility was too close to its neighbors and that it was unlawful and they had to shut down. So it sort of escalated as things went on. Mm-hmm. And we took this particular case on as a piece of litigation against the township, who had told this farm they had to stop their business and close down their livestock facility. And ultimately, we were able to work with the township and get the business license that was required. They didn't want to provide that because they didn't want there to be traffic in the area, but we found sort of a compromise way for that to take place. And then as far as this issue with the livestock facility, we were in litigation, and a judge, in my opinion, misread the Michigan, what they call GAMPs, generally acceptable agricultural management practices. And in Michigan, you're protected by the right to farm law as long as you're following generally acceptable practices. And those practices said the livestock facility should be 250 feet away from the neighbor's home. And a judge read that as being 250 feet away from the property line. And so that was going to shut this down completely. And we were able to appeal and work with the State Department of Ag in Michigan to create a more crystal clear, generally acceptable practice, which meant that our folks could stay in operation and return to selling their goods. So we're not necessarily always in litigation over something like this, but it's a clear example of how you have someone farming and doing things right. They were an independent, diversified farm. They did meats, they did vegetables, they did raw dairy. But the township didn't want there to be traffic in that area. They wanted that to just be agricultural land where the farmers would truck things into other places, right? They didn't want that kind of community. And so it's an example of that kind of obstacle, or a neighbor, even though you're abutting agricultural land, being upset that, there's animals next door. That in so many different ways, our members face those kind of problems all the time, right? So that's one example where we were able to, and in that state, the local MDARD, the Michigan Department of Agriculture, actually was very amenable to working with us to change those standards to make it clear that what our members were doing was perfectly lawful, and to support the members doing that work. So that was one example. Kind of a really interesting, I think, exciting example is not a farmer, but a food producer in Maine. In this case, it's actually still pending. So if folks wanted to visit our website and take a look, there's definitely a news article about our Maine litigation that you could check out. And I'll just say it's farmtoconsumer.org is our site. I'm sure you'll give me a chance later, but
yes,
I wanted to say
that. Absolutely.
But the Maine litigation doesn't involve a farmer, but people in the community that were working under the new Maine food sovereignty law, which is very exciting statute in Maine passed several years ago to provide that local communities got to choose what kind of regulation or lack of regulation they wanted over certain food production. So as long as it was locally produced food, a municipality or township has the opportunity in Maine to say, you don't need a particular business license or a home kitchen to prepare food. And so we had members in a community that had that kind of law. They were producing food, and the State Department of Health said, no, you still need you need a license to do this. And to get that license, you need a commercial kitchen. Now, to have a commercial kitchen would have been cost prohibitive for the members that were involved, right? And they're selling directly to their community, to people that they know, and they're getting the products from the farms next door. And you've got the state deciding that somehow, you have to have these licenses, and somehow you have to have this big, expensive, fancy kitchen in order for it to be safe, right? And so that's something that, again, a policy that's geared towards larger organizations, folks that have the money, and really cuts against individuals' abilities to just produce food and consumers to get food from who they want it from, right? Maine also passed a constitutional amendment, right to food, saying that producers have the right to produce and provide real food to folks, and consumers have the right to choose who they get their food from, right? Which we think is really exciting. And so when the Department of Health shut down the folks that were producing food, we filed a lawsuit on their behalf as well, and that is still pending. There's been a lot of activity where the local ordinance has been changed, and so where things stand in court has changed. But we're going to stand by people's ability by law to produce food and provide it directly to consumers where they have that ability. So in those two cases, we were involved in court action to defend our members' ability to provide real food to folks. So those are two things, one past, one present, that I can think of. As you pointed out, some of it's somewhat mundane. And so you can't sell raw milk in a certain state. So we help them with their herd share agreements so that folks that know and understand the nutritional benefits have access to that. We've been involved lately in meat processing. We say our food system has been vulnerable for quite some time, but COVID seems to really have emphasized, particularly in meat processing, if you shut down one plant because people are sick, that's like, a sixth of US food production. And so we really want to support small livestock producers being able to do that, to produce food. But the challenge there is, to sell meat, you have to bring it to a USDA facility or a state facility. To get appointments at those facilities, you either have to be large and have a high volume of meat, or maybe you'll get a date a couple of years out because you just don't have the priority or the volume, which again, smaller folks can't do. So one of the things we help people with is selling portions of a live animal, and then the new owner can have that processed by a custom slaughter facility for their own use. So as long as that meat is not sold, it's lawful. So we sell the animal before it's processed instead of after it's processed is perfectly lawful. So we'll help folks figure that out. I'll also say we're also still working on policy to make things like that better. So we're working on supporting something called the Prime Act, which would allow folks to use these custom slaughter facilities and then sell the meat, right? And these facilities are federally regulated. And that would, for our independent farms that are raising animals humanely and pastured, to be able to bring them to a closer facility and not hundreds of miles away is a lot better for them. Yeah. So, we will litigate, we'll work on policy, we'll help folks find ways around it. One thing I think we've seen a lot of, for some reason, in the last couple of years, are complaints about livestock guard dogs, right? So you might have a small independent farm and you're doing things the natural way, which is having your dogs protect your flock of poultry, rather than having an electric fence or, some other method, or leaving the chickens locked up all day, every day, which is what industrial production will do. And neighbors not liking that dogs bark, right? So but this is how folks have always protected, right, their animals from prey.
Yeah.
And they'll file these under nuisance actions. And a lot of states have pretty good right to farm laws that say if it's a commercial enterprise and you're following acceptable practices, you're allowed to engage in those practices, right? Without having the government come after you for some sort of nuisance action. So that's another thing we've seen a lot of. So yeah, really, it can be quite broad.
Yeah.
The thing.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that you are so heavily involved in policy work, because, if you can change the policy, then the litigation kind of goes away, right? I think that's so important. And so, and one other thing that I want to point out is, as you've sort of mentioned, you are a national organization. You will go anywhere in the country and help these farmers and other food producers.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. And we'll work under what's frustrating for a lot of these smaller producers is that you'll have federal regulations and state regulations, and then your local zoning and township and departments of health. So the levels of regulation really can be cumbersome and very difficult to figure out. But we do represent people at all those different levels, and we'll do it across the country. Yeah. And the other thing I guess I'll say on policies, there are other groups that work on policy, but what I think is unique about our organization and critical about our organization is that while we are always going to be working on policy to try to make the environment for independent farms better, day in and day out, folks still need the help today, right? And so there's not a lot of groups really just recognizing that so many farms are being issued with potential violations or, suggestions that they can't engage in these practices. And folks need help right now today, as well as seeing that policy changed, right? And so we try to provide that representation just in folks' daily operations as well. So the two together, I think, are important. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so you've mentioned the word member several times. So let's talk about how do people get access to your services? What does membership mean? And talk about how people becoming members is what pays for your legal defense services to these farmers and other food producers. So can you talk about that whole side of it?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we are a membership-based organization, and we have different kinds of membership. And yes, a good portion of our revenue is raised from the membership dues, which I think are still incredibly low because most of our members really need them to be low. So for a farmer, for example, it's still only $125 a year. The theory is folks are members, and then an issue comes around, they are entitled to the representation, right? So we're serving our members, but we make membership easy and not expensive to be part of. But you cannot just sort of have a problem and then contact us and hope that we'll be able to resolve it, because that model just would, well, frankly, probably bankrupt us, right? And so we do have members with membership dues. We have different levels for farmers, for artisan food producers, and for homesteaders. So folks that are growing food for themselves, they're not engaged in commercial activity, but they still are coming up against, municipal regulations and that sort of thing, which reminds me of another interesting case, if you care to hear it in a minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
So farmers, homesteaders, food producers, and then we also have consumer members, which is a $50 membership for an annual membership. And for consumers, they will have access to our educational resources. They'll receive our newsletters. They obviously don't necessarily receive legal representation. That's more a function of what we need to provide to our food producers and farmers. But to be a consumer member is really a way for consumers to support the independent farms that they want to purchase the food from, right? So we always suggest that consumers join on a regular basis and stay members so that these farms, to help support these farms and so that we can provide legal representation at quite an affordable cost to the membership, both farmers and food producers. So, and folks can see information on how to join on our website, which is farmtoconsumer.org. We'll take phone calls. I can give you that number at the end if you want, if people want to join. But the idea is that we wish to be a community of people that believe in the ability to produce real, healthy, sustainably grown food, and to have access to that as consumers, and to be able to make our own food choices, right? Both in terms of production and access to those foods. And so by being membership based, we're present at a lot of different events. We provide a lot of educational resources and a lot of information on what's happening in terms of policy. And it's a way for consumers to get involved in policy, right? So if we know, for example, that a state is thinking of improving its raw milk laws, which we've been seeing a lot of in the last year or two.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Our members will get notified that this is happening, and we can encourage them to contact their legislators and to support this change, and tell them how to find those legislators, et cetera. So they can also be very involved at the policy level as consumer members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I love the organization, fully support, and so I'm thrilled that you exist and are providing that service. So if you want to tell that story that just came to mind, that would be awesome, and then we'll kind of give you one last time to give contact information and any last things, and then we'll be done.
Yeah, thank you. The reason it came to mind is because it was a Homestead member, and I was listing Homestead membership.
Yeah,
and. Right. But one thing I want to point out, whether it's for commercial sales or it's homesteading, we have members that are both, on agriculturally zoned, historical agricultural land that tends to be more rural, but also folks that are homesteading in what might be considered suburban lots or even urban lots, right? And that's where a lot of things will seem to get in the way. You want to produce your own eggs because they're healthier, but you may live in a town that doesn't allow for, say, backyard chickens, for example, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing a real push of consumer interest in changing these regulations so they can produce more of their own food, but a lot of municipalities and townships fighting back. Again, why? Not entirely sure, because they want the sort of pristine lawn as opposed to growing food. Mm-hmm. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me since everybody has to eat, right?
Yeah.
But the story that came to mind was a homesteader who is very knowledgeable and well trained in regenerative agriculture, but an urban farmer who had purchased property in Gary, Indiana. And I'm sure that we still have this story up on our website somewhere as well. But as you can imagine, right, it abutted some properties that had been neglected and abandoned. And these homesteaders really were doing an impressive job on the property and engaging in practices to heal the soil so that they could start growing food for themselves and their family in urban limits. They're cited by the city because they have, a barrel on the property, for example, that the city considers to be junk, right? Or wood chips in the front yard instead of a pristine lawn, but the wood chips are a way of regenerating the soil and healing the soil. And so it just was an example of sort of a really ludicrous ordinances that would suggest you have to have this pristine urban lawn without junk, while down the street, right, are like falling apart older homes and completely abandoned lots. Yeah, but if someone's actually in the house, they're going to enforce these ordinances. And so we ultimately we litigated that case at the local level, but ultimately really reached a settlement which allowed the member to continue with these practices. I mean, there were some compromises and some things done in the yard to satisfy the city, but ultimately we're able to resolve that issue. And they've done amazing work regenerating this land and are now growing their own food in Gary, Indiana. And so I wanted to share that, not only because it was a success story, but to remind folks it's not just sort of rural areas, right? And I think more and more consumers and more cooks and chefs and nutrition experts want to grow more of their own food, and working on local policy changes like allowing for chickens, allowing for gardens in the front yard, not just the backyard, allowing for hoop houses, right? These are things that we want to see in any land use that folks might have, right? So we help members at these different levels and in different ways. So that one had just come to mind as a real success story, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. And, I can see how that kind of happened. And to a certain degree, some of these, in that situation, these local, whatever, policymakers, seeing the barrel, seeing the wood chips, in some ways, with a dilapidated, falling down house, just, a block away, it seems so arbitrary, like without any kind of real purpose. But on another level, you kind of have to say, well, is it just simply out of true ignorance? And these people really have no connection with food and how food is produced and how important it is for there to be good soil, healthy soil, vibrant soil in order to produce food. Like, I don't know if it's so much ignorance or just like this elitist arbitrariness. I don't know. I can't figure it out. It is baffling to me.
Right. I mean, I think different communities are different, frankly, right? And I think some communities may have originally been formed around this idea that they were going to be more urban or suburban, and food would be purchased from agricultural areas. And so they wanted sort of a certain standard of living or a certain look to the property. And so those are on the books. And then when they're violated, they will enforce them, or when there are complaints, they will enforce them. But so I think sometimes there hasn't been real thought to it. It's like, this is what we did when we formed the community 30 years ago, and hasn't given more thought to what would be a better way for food supply to be provided. And then sometimes I think it is ignorance. It's not the first time that we've seen people suggest that people had garbage in their yard, when it's just, to farm is not pristine, right? Yes. And so there often is ignorance as well. Absolutely. And so I think being able to talk to these communities and see what we might be able to resolve, one community I'm working with at the moment, okay, they don't want the roosters, but don't prohibit the chickens, right? Because then people can at least lay their eggs, get healthy food to themselves. A lot of communities take that position, for example. So, but I think that it's a shifting of mindset that we really need, and that people are starting to come around in that urban and near suburban communities have had no real connection to the land, right? Someone else somewhere else is growing the food. But I think that we're starting to learn that a decentralized food system and food supply is safer for the country, is better for the community, is better for the environment. And we need to work with policymakers to let policy keep up with those realizations, right? And some are doing a great job and some are not, and so I don't really understand the motivation all the time either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, so interesting. And, once again, I'll just say, I am thrilled that you are out there doing this work because it is critically important. And all of us, I think, need to take more of an interest in where our food is being produced and supporting those people who do it if we're not going to do it ourselves. So.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a lovely conversation. I've had such a good time talking to you. Do you want to give us all of your contact information again, website, any kind of social media stuff that you guys do, phone numbers, anything that people need to know to learn more and reach out to you?
Yes, thank you. I would love that. So again, our full name is Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. Our website is farmtoconsumer.org. We can also be reached at 703-208-3276. We are on social media. I'm not sure that I can give you how you get there, but but if you go to our website at farmtoconsumer.org, we certainly have Facebook, and we are on YouTube, and we are on X, formerly Twitter. Clearly, I'm not the one that engages with our social media.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I couldn't tell you what our social media is either, but we do have someone who knows that. So,
and I'll also just say that we are membership based, but we also engage in fundraising activities on a regular basis to keep these amounts low or encourage consumers to be consumer members to support this work. We have a very small core of folks that work on things on a day-to-day basis, but we also hire a lot of local attorneys in these different areas when these issues come up. And so we work very hard at getting good deals and pro bono attorneys working for us, but it's always still an expense. And so any support that folks can bring to the organization is always really appreciated. So these independent farms really can't go out and just hire a high-priced attorney to help them with these matters.
mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, wonderful. Alexia, anything else that you want to say that I didn't ask you about? Any points you want to make that we didn't talk about already?
I could think the only thing, well, first and foremost, of course, I just want to thank you for having me. It's great to be able to reach your audience. And I know that folks that really care about the food they eat will care about where it comes from as well. Mm-hmm. But I do encourage folks to go on the website and think about policy and, join at least our email lists, because there's a lot going on across the country in terms of these small changes. And some of it is quite positive. We're seeing more access to raw milk, more access to cottage food, but having more people involved in demanding these things can always help with those efforts. Mm-hmm. And so folks starting to follow us and support policy efforts as well is always very welcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, because, I get pushback sometimes. People tell me that I'm sort of pushing this agenda that not everybody is able to participate in because not everybody can afford to buy, high quality food and access directly from the farmer. And, and why are you talking about that? And my answer is, well, if you want better food and better access to food, you have to get involved and create the demand for that and get involved in the organizations that are making that possible. We can't just say, oh, well, I don't have access to it. Oh, well, I'll eat at, whatever corner fast food restaurant it is every day. And that's just what I have to live with. So I am in complete agreement with you about that.
Yeah, good food does cost a bit more, and farmers deserve that. And my attitude is I'd rather pay more now than for healthcare later.
Yeah.
For some of these issues, right?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you on that one. Yep. All right. Well, I could go on forever, but I don't want to take up any more of your time today. I know you're really busy. So thank you so much, Alexia. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Hi there, and thanks for listening today. If what you heard today inspires you to want to pursue an education in holistic nutrition here at Nutrition Therapy Institute, please check us out on our website, ntischool.com, and reach out to us at admissions@ntischool.com. Our in-depth, comprehensive education is sure to provide you with the knowledge and skills you need to create the work of your dreams. Do something that feeds your passion, aligns with your values, and fuels your drive for a vital and meaningful life. It will be rewarding for yourself, your family, and anyone else with whom you interact. And with that, see you on the next episode.